First, just really quickly to thank the school here at University of Michigan, in particular Dean Ponce de Leon and Chair John McMurrow, for bringing me here. It's my first time here in Michigan, so it's a real pleasure to be here. The paper or the talk I'm going to present actually follows something I delivered at UIC in Chicago some months ago, and I also want to thank Penelope for her encouragement in continuing to develop this for publication. So, as Amy said, I'm going to talk a little bit about Redcon and also discuss perhaps a more fictional approach to history and, in fact, to time itself. But before that, sort of two anecdotes and a caveat. I was in Vegas recently on my way to New York, and I was sitting at the airport, and I started thinking about the Bellagio by John Jurdy. And Steve Wynn said about 12 years ago, John Jurdy is the Bernini of our time. These are the cathedrals of our time. This is the future of architecture, which is kind of confusing when you think about it, but I kind of think actually John Jurdy is more like the Wayne Newton of our time, and that you really cannot fake history. And so with that in mind, I think that really discussions about applying history to practice, at least certainly my own practice, I don't know are germane. The second observation was that, recently a student of mine at SCI-Arc, as a thesis prep student, came to me with Aldo Rossi's scientific autobiography in hand, and this guy's all of like 22, and he said, "What's this?" And I said, "I don't know. What the hell are you doing with it?" I do know, but it was interesting. I said, "Why did you find this?" And he said, "Well, I'm really sick of talking about software." And I don't want to sort of bash software today, but I do think that it's interesting that you can't really repress history. It'll find its way, and the kids, as far as I'm concerned, are all right. They're, the more we teach software, the more interested they'll get in other things, so I think we should just keep teaching it, and they'll find their way. So hopefully we can stop talking about parametricism in this conference, I hope. I don't think it's old enough yet to be historicized, but anyway. So Redcon it's a technique that's used primarily in science fiction and comic book writing, two things that are dear to my heart, and it's a means of actually allowing characters to disappear and reappear, be killed off. The facts sort of stay the same, but they can be changed. And I thought that this quote by Mr. Tupper here, that that the history flows fundamentally from the future into the past, and that the future is basically not a product of the past, was very interesting. I'm also a big fan of Doctor who said, "What is the use of a good quotation if you can't change it?" And finally, for those of you who are interested in quantum mechanics, time does not flow. Other times are just special cases of other universes. So what I'm going to try to do is not be an architect or a historian, because I'm really quite not either of those yet. I'm a little bit more of a time traveler today. And I'm very interested in the idea that we can have a relationship to history that is parallel to how it's been constructed or fictionalized. So this is a little ambitious, and probably for those of you who are real historians, completely heretical, but it's an attempt to kind of look at what I'm calling a parallel postmodern project. And I've been very interested in Rudolph lately, in an empathetic way, actually, because of the sort of particular narrative and trajectory of his career. But, this is the sort of standard narrative, I suppose, of the career of Paul Rudolph, which would be that it would assume that time and history are linear, and that certain events, crises, in the first case, you sort of see on the left towards a new architecture and the beginning of a modern avant-garde, and its interruption, some 60 years later by complexity and contradiction in architecture, and the demise of certain figures with that transition, and then the introduction of a new set of characters. So Rams is Robert A.M. Stern, Michael Graves, Peter Eisenman, and the rest I think you know, or hope you know. But in my version, I would assume that time and history is parallel and not linear, and in fact loops. And there is actually some scientific evidence to the fact that we may actually live in parallel universes. But in any case, in this version, Paul Rudolph doesn't disappear and is not obscured by the arrival of postmodern critical theory in architecture, but rather kind of enters another cycle. So I would argue that in the late work of Paul Rudolph, especially the work that he completed in Southeast Asia, there are many Paul Rudolphs. There's a PR 2A, B, C, D, etc. So again, this is fictional. So, all right. So really, what I'm going to do, and I think that this follows some advice that Jeff Kipnis gave me, which was that the best way to sort of be a reflective or reflexive practitioner would be to stand on the shoulders of giants, put on soccer cleats, and jump up and down repeatedly. So, with all due respect to Paul Rudolph, I'm going to show you some projects that I'm reinterpreting quite creatively, and then I'll show you some of my own work. And really, I was sympathetic to what Mark said yesterday about a kind of empathetic approach to history. I feel in some ways that the kind of narrative of, or the trajectory, let's say, an arc of Rudolph's life, success, influence, collapse, and obscurity, have been misinterpreted. And I would sort of argue that in a lot of the work that was conducted in his office in the 70s and 80s in Southeast Asia, he set the groundwork for a series of contemporary practitioners, myself included. So just quickly, the first category of work I would call uneasy edges, by which I refer to, in Rudolph's work, but also a kind of emergence in my own work, a kind of suspicion, let's say, and remember that time is looping here, that smoothness, softness, topology have been interests that have led us lemming-like over the precipice towards something with no bottom. And what I'd like to argue is for a return to the topics of distinct figuration, the division of labor in a building between unique components, the production of clear profiles, in an effort to produce an architecture that is in tension, that is uneasy. So this project here in Jakarta, Indonesia, an office building from 1981, is the production of a series of I think quite interesting, and I'm sorry this is so light, operations conducted in plan, which if studied in plan don't seem to produce, or would not seem to indicate that you could produce a kind of a ripple effect on a facade as magically as it does. This is the section. You can see actually the depth of the balconies, which you see here, which I think are quite remarkable, don't really figure too heavily in either plan or section. But I'm fascinated by this work because it seems to me that through a fairly controlled number of moves, Rudolph was able to actually produce something that, in my mind, still has a very contemporary effect. I don't like to use that word, but I'm interested in the sense that by manually scripting the production of a facade, you could produce as intense as, let's say, an effect or a sensation as one would get out of something far more complicated run through a software package. This is another project, Beach Road 2, Singapore, 1981. Many of these were not built. Here he kind of reverses the section to produce a kind of Brancusi-like totem. And finally, my favorite work of his in Singapore is the concourse, which Michael Graves criticized as being endless, and I believe at a conference in the mid-'80s said that the problem he had with Rudolph's work was that it had no beginning and no end, and for me I think that's exactly what's interesting about it. Finally, a competition entry in Hong Kong, Sino Tower, 1989. Here I think a really interesting decoupling excuse me, of facade systems from the columnar structure, producing I think a kind of hybrid then between the previous schemes. One in which sort of verticality can actually be calibrated by not only sectional but planimetric modulation. I don't have any plans for that. So this is our first experiment. It's quite horrible, but it was a competition entry that we did last year, and the attempt was sort of to begin to see if we could synthesize breaks and stoppages in a tower, and that it's produced primarily through variations in an octagonal plan. But also has a very strange section. But here again, we're trying to sort of figure out if it's possible to think about a tower again, not as a synthetic envelope, but as a series of conditions that break, start, and stop again. And these are some early tests that we did. And obviously, we were looking at Brancusi a lot as well. Okay, so another technique that I'm suggesting Mr. Rudolph developed, but never mentioned, is the non-relational arrangement of forms, which is simply another way of saying that techniques of collage, overlay, and superposition may be used, in particular in the design and organization of very large-scale systems or urban areas. And what's liberating, I suppose, for me is the realization that the desire or the contemporary desire to suture and seam and smooth differences is actually quite unproductive when working at the scale of the city, because in fact there are too many factors of combination that one would have to actually account for. So what I think here is that the goal of urban design, in fact, should be to produce a kind of sedimentary condition or layering. This is a project by Rudolph's office in Bangladesh, which was then East Pakistan, 1965 through 1975. And I'm most interested in the work that he produced outside of the United States, because it seems that he was able to be much freer compositionally. But what's interesting here is that you have a kind of family of crenellated forms, which are sort of teased out across the site. You can see they scale up or down. There isn't a sort of smoothing of the transitions between the forms, which I suppose makes it sort of modern in some ways. But there is a sort of desire, as I said, to work through the problem of non-relational composition. In other words, not a need to kind of show or demonstrate transition from space to space or from form to form or from program to program, but actually to emphasize the differences between them. So this project here was completed with Olin. We got 6th place in a competition in Cairo. And as you know, many other things happened, so I believe the competition's been canceled. But the brief was to basically weld together two parts of the city. On the left is the kind of colonial grid, the Franco-British colonial grid, with some tweaking by the Germans, which they always do. And on the right, the Khedivial or Caliphate medieval fabric. And so working with Olin, you know, the sort of setup for the scheme was to anticipate ways in which we could suture the two sites together, primarily using sort of landscape and pathway networks, and then we would set into that a series of larger scale programs. So in the lower right is a bus terminal that rides on top of a new metro station. In between are a series of kind of informal market areas. The kind of crinkly donut on the lower left is in fact a retail venue, a mall, and then interspersed on the other two bands. And I should mention that there's kind of a commerce band at the bottom, a civic band in the middle, and a ceremonial band at the top. And then in the middle band there's a fencing club, a new national theater, and in the ceremonial band a park, a new museum of modern art, and a library. So the pieces sort of relate to each other in some ways, or rather they're glued together, I suppose, by landscape, but they really kind of only nominally relate to each other formally. This is an image of the fencing club, and it sort of rides out over a pit. And so here you sort of see a family of buildings that have, at different scales, sort of informal real communications between each other, I guess. They're not really, you know, we've been trying to not make things the same, I guess. All right, so finally, and I have 2 minutes, two other concepts, I think, derived from Mr. Rudolph. One is the economy of form, the other is sleight of hand. Economy of form is not about cheapness, per se, or arte povera, or optimization. It's rather about kind of precisely extracting from material and structural limitations a kind of expressive form. So it produces then a sort of fitness, I think, between an economical means and an expressive form. And sleight of hand is a little different. It refers to techniques that produce an eloquent yet mysterious object. It's concerned, I believe, with a sculptural agenda, which I think you see in a lot of Rudolph's work towards the end, especially at the urban scale. And it may be related to structural indeterminacy. And finally, and this is sort of a nod to Ed Ruscha, it produces a wow effect, as opposed to a wow, effect. And that's, Mr. Ruscha was asked once what defined a bad work of art. And he said a bad work of art produced a wow, effect, meaning it's interesting, but why the hell would you do that? Whereas a wow effect would mean, why would you do that? That's really interesting. So that's the hope of sleight of hand. So one of my favorite projects in Hong Kong, I think quite better situated in that city, and I think a better piece of architecture than the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank by Norman Foster or the Bank of China by Ann Pei, is the Lippo Center, previously the Bond Center, designed for Australian entrepreneur Alan Bond in 1984. And what's really fascinating about this scheme to me is that Rudolph produces an incredible sort of flicker across the facade, and it's not actually the product of very deep formal manipulation. Rather, it's the response to essentially a commercial developer's brief. And what he really plays with is the relative position of the edge of the office tower slab to this octagonal column grid. You'll notice in these plans that obviously the columns and the core don't move. The only thing that really moves are the edges of the slabs, which, if you add them up correctly, start to initiate quite an interesting play, especially given the use of its reflective glass with the skyline. So we've tried that. This is a project for a medium-sized Kunsthalle on Wilshire Boulevard for a client in Los Angeles. It's in Koreatown. And it's different in a sense because structurally we've been working with Happold, and it's a series of geodes stacked on top of each other that are essentially made up of structural arms off which a series of non-orthogonal cages are hung. The entire thing is kind of impaled on the core, which you see at the center of this plan. So here, the core is stable. The envelopes move around a lot. This is the theater. And when you put it all together, it gives you a section like this in one direction. It rides on top of the Normandy and Wilshire Metro stop. There's a Carl's Jr. on the site right now. And in the other direction, it seems to sort of topple or teeter. And then that, in the aggregate, that's what's produced. A lot of work has been done on this project to actually understand what the structural capacity would be for a sort of misaligned series of volumes. So what you see here basically then are a series of outdoor gallery zones, and then sort of to the left are roof gardens. And one of the interests we had also was kind of playing with, and I think this is part of Rudolph's mission in Southeast Asia, is playing with the relationship between an internal and an exterior environment. And that's it. So, thank you.